A very warm welcome to Eye on the Money, the television show that gives you insights into how to improve your financial well-being as well as make your money work for you. I'm Ingrid Nantege, and today on the show we discuss a 2021 Sweep South report on the socio-economic impact of the pandemic on domestic workers. Now, while many African nations were initially praised for their quick response to the pandemic, the resulting economic fallout had a devastating effect on the livelihoods of many workers. While glimmers of hope have started to emerge with the rollout of vaccines across the world, Africa has lagged behind. This has threatened the prospect of an economic bounce back, benefiting domestic workers who are among the worst affected. This is particularly relevant considering their reliance on the income of their employer and their frequent exploitation. Now joining me on the show to discuss the socio-economic impact of the pandemic on domestic workers in line with the 2021 Sweep South Domestic Worker Annual Report is Aisha Pandor, the CEO and co-founder of Sweep South. Aisha, welcome to the show, Sweep South. Such a play on the tongue. Thank you very much for making time to join us.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Great. So I'd like us to talk about this report that really sought to find out the impact of the pandemic 1 year later on domestic workers. So just to start us off, maybe you could talk to us about the report, what it sought to investigate, and what would you say were the key highlights? Because I know it focused on South Africa, it focused on Nigeria, but maybe if you could explain to us in the context of Kenya.
Sure. So this report is an annual report that we carry out on domestic workers. This is the fourth year that we've done it. Previously, we focused on South Africa. This year, we had 7,000 respondents who we surveyed, the majority still coming from South Africa, but as you say, also including Kenya and Nigeria. And we look at a number of factors, and what we're really trying to do is collect data on the living, working, and earning conditions of domestic workers across the continent. This industry is very fragmented. It's not an industry that typically has a lot of data available. And so it's difficult without reports like this to look at, how much are domestic workers earning? How does that compare to their living costs? And how does that compare to minimum wage, for example? So this year, as I said, we surveyed domestic workers, South Africa, Kenya, Nigeria, looked at how they're faring this year compared to last year as a result of the pandemic. And some high-level findings were that we found that there were high levels of unemployment amongst domestic workers. In Kenya, 1 in 2 domestic workers saying that they had lost jobs as a result of the pandemic. A reduction in earnings as a result of the pandemic, all of these lockdowns, meaning that people aren't able to work, and concerns about coming into contact with household members meant that people were earning less. And also, obviously, living costs going up and people getting into debt and struggling to make ends meet as a result of all of this.
So Aisha, you said this is an annual report, fourth year you're doing this, and you also did a similar report last year, but the focus was on actually the pandemic because we were really in the thick of it. So 1 year later, if we were to draw a comparison on the findings that you found last year, and we all know the sort of impact, the pandemic had on different people's finances, on different economies. So if we were to draw an impact on last year going into this year in terms of the findings, are we seeing a situation where things are getting better? Are things getting worse? What would you say? What would be your take on the same?
So I think definitely seeing some recovery from last year. If I think about when we did the survey mid last year, we were really in the thick of the response to the pandemic. So harsh lockdowns across the continent. What we've seen is that there's been some recovery in earnings. So 10 to 20% increase from last year, but still nowhere near what earnings were looking like in 2019. We've unfortunately seen, though, that, and this is likely a longer-term impact because of what people have been through over the last year, that many people in debt, and particularly, again, from Kenyan respondents, finding that many people in debt, over 70%, many saying that they really feel hopeless, 40% saying they feel hopeless about the ability to pay back debts. And some of the things that we also looked at were the number of respondents who had children, who had dependents, Kenya, on average, Kenyan respondents have less dependents than South African and Nigerian respondents, but still, struggling to care for families, struggling to cover all of the household costs still.
So, and you mentioned you somehow touched onto my next question, and I was going to ask, considering you focused on 3 countries, which is South Africa, Nigeria, and Kenya, all of which somehow have somewhat different economies, I'd like you to help us understand in terms of the findings, the difference within the 3 economies. And I would like you to focus on Kenya and maybe if there are any key lessons they can draw from, some of those other countries that you surveyed, and also maybe at the findings, somehow a reflection on how the different countries or governments responded to the pandemic. What does that look like on that front?
Sure. So I think, what we've seen is where there's been a harsher lockdown, there were definitely more drastic effects last year. But what we see between the different countries is that, unfortunately, in Kenya and Nigeria, a higher amount of job losses. So 50% saying that they had lost jobs as a result of the pandemic, whereas in South Africa, that number was only 20%. We've also surveyed, again, the number of dependents that people have, found that Kenyan respondents have less dependents, but more Kenyan respondents are single parents and primary breadwinners. So up to 70%, one person taking care of the entire household. Other interesting findings were around sources of income. So looking at which respondents had additional sources of income. Domestic workers in Kenya seem to rely more on domestic work as a primary source of income, whereas in South Africa and Nigeria, over 40% had an additional source of income. And that just speaks to the fact that, if you are not able to work your main job as domestic work, if there's a lockdown that prevents you from going to work, Kenyan workers being less shielded from the negative financial impacts of that because they aren't able to earn through other sources.
So Aisha, speaking generally, and this is last year leading into this year, 1 year later, we're still, suffering from the crazy effects of the pandemic, be it in our personal lives, be it in our business lives, be it economically. So we've seen a situation where almost all sectors of the economy have been affected. And this is not even just select to domestic workers. And in line with that, we've also seen so many industries adapt and modify to somehow fit into the current realities to ensure survival, to ensure, longevity. My question then is in line with the findings. Is there room for that in this space? And what does it say about the need to change around, the way domestic workers operate, as well as considering the people who pay these workers were also affected by the pandemic?
Yeah, absolutely. So, one of the concerning findings from the Kenyan study in particular was that respondents are earning significantly less than minimum wage. And so I think that's one of the first basic things that can be done is just adhere to minimum wage. Make sure that if you are employing the services of a domestic worker, make sure that you're paying a fair wage. And over and above that, that you're looking at additional ways that you can provide support. So as an example, with Sweep South, what we're doing is we provide vouchers for domestic workers at reduced costs to be able to handle living costs so that your groceries are cheaper, your data might be cheaper, and that gives you a little bit more disposable income to cover other costs. Another thing that we've recommended is obviously vaccine rollout. We know that we're lagging behind as a continent. But positive findings from Kenya were that we had the highest number of respondents, 75%, saying that they had either had a vaccination or would be very willing to take a vaccination, compared to much lower percentages in the other countries. So there's obviously a good vaccine education program going on, and potentially vaccine rollout.
Now, Aisha, this is something you've really touched on, and also you mentioned that the reason why really the survey was carried out is to investigate how much domestic workers earn in tandem to the cost of living. So when I was going through the report, I came across one of the findings that that pointed to the fact that both Kenya and South Africa show a deficit when comparing earnings to basic costs. So my question then is, first of all, what does this mean when it comes to the social impact, socioeconomic health or well-being of domestic workers? And at the same time, how can this be addressed? How does this then have a trickle-down effect into almost everything that happens?
So, I mean, it means that families are either not covering household expenses, and when that happens, often variable costs are sacrificed. And variable costs are things like food, airtime and data, electricity. So, you find households who are having to cover costs like rent and transport to be able to go out to work or to search for work. And then really, not covering food costs, for example, which has drastic impacts on the rest of the family. So what happens in that case is people are often getting into debt, and again, getting into debt that they feel they aren't going to be able to service adequately, and that leads to all sorts of longer-term issues. So it leads to stress and anxiety. It leads to potentially being blacklisted. It leads to your inability to find other forms of work because of a bad credit record. So quite drastic impacts. And what we can do to help in these situations is roll out programs that help to support, so grant funds, for example, that help to support domestic workers and other workers as we're recovering from the pandemic. We can, again, adhere to minimum wage. We can make sure that there is adequate legislation in place to cater for domestic workers, and then that legislation is adhered to. So there's a difference between having the right, legal protections in place, minimum wage, for example, but if people aren't really adhering to it and it's not being enforced, then, it's very difficult to make sure that people are behaving correctly.
And I'm so glad you've brought out the aspect of legislation, which is what I would like us to talk about next. However, I believe at this point, it's a good point to take a very, very quick break. But remember, if you're watching us from home, you can send your feedback, comments, queries to our social media handles at Metropol TV KE on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We'll be right back.